The respected Fraser of Allender Institute says public services north of the border might be hit by £1.6 billion by 2020. Even their optimistic projection would still see the Scottish budget reduced. So tonight, I'll ask a panel of politicians where the cuts might fall. Hello and welcome to Scotland 2016. There are tough economic choices on the horizon, with a worst-case scenario of £1 billion cut to local councils. So is the Scottish Government right to continue to prioritise health, childcare and police spending? Holyrood's politicians blame each other for the possible consequences of such cuts. But do any of them have a solution that avoids the financial pain? And in the US presidential race, an unwell Hillary Clinton is replaced on the campaign trail. Can Donald Trump capitalise on her absence? Some public services could face budget cuts of almost a fifth over the next 4 years, according to independent forecasters. The cuts could come under the worst-case scenario for Scottish Government funding, outlined today in a report by the Fraser of Allender Institute, which is part of the University of Strathclyde. Hugh Williams has the story.
There are just under 100 pages in this report. It contains a great deal of detail and different scenarios as the authors try to model and predict the future. It's available online for anyone to read, but just in case you haven't downloaded or looked through your own personal copy yet, let me try and pick out some of the key points. So, if you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin.
What the Scottish Government can spend depends on the cash that comes from Westminster under the Barnett formula and on money raised here by devolved taxes. When planned changes take effect, tax revenues raised in Scotland will fund half of public spending here, and the block grant will be adjusted to take account of those new tax-raising powers. If Scotland's economy matches the performance of the rest of the UK, the impact will be neutral. If Scotland's economy performs less well, there'll be less to spend. And if Scotland outperforms the rest of the UK, there'll be more money. But Scotland's economy has grown by 0.6% in the past year, compared with 1.7% for the rest of the UK. And looking to the future, there are two big areas of uncertainty. What will leaving the EU mean? And what will the impact be of the UK government's decision to reset its fiscal policy to abandon the goal of budget surplus by 2019-2020? So the outlook seems challenging. The report warns that the Scottish Government should prepare for possible real-term cuts. Best case, down by 2.8%, £700 million. Worst case, down by 6.2%, £1.6 billion. But it's already made a number of policy commitments on health, police and childcare provision. Keeping those promises would mean even deeper cuts for unprotected areas, around 16% over the course of this Parliament. So tough choices ahead, but it's also true that the Scottish Government will have more powers than ever before.
Hugh Williams reporting. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the director of the Fraser of Allender Institute, Graham Roy, about those projections and how he came up with that worst-case scenario.
Even before the EU referendum, the Chancellor was planning to take around about 3.5% out of the Scottish budget in real terms over the course of the next Parliament. So what we do in the report today is really just set out what scenarios may happen going forward now that the Chancellor has promised to reset fiscal policy in his autumn statement. So we look at a range of different scenarios. The one that lets us come at the worst case scenario is a situation where the Chancellor decides, in the light of Brexit and a potential shock to the economy and a weakening UK fiscal position, that he's going to cut expenditure even more in the short term. And it's then added on top of that with the new fiscal powers that are coming to Scotland, actually Scottish revenues being slightly slower growing over the next few years. And is that shock to the economy guaranteed? Philip Hammond, who is the new Chancellor, talked about Brexit having a chilling effect on the economy. Well, I mean, there's a debate about the extent of the shock that economists will predict that will happen over the next few years, the general consensus is that it will be a negative shock. The scale of it is uncertain, but we can be very confident that the economy will now grow more slowly over the next few years than it would have been if it hadn't had the shock of the EU referendum choosing to leave.
But given that reset that Philip Hammond's talked about, what do you understand that to mean? Does it mean that austerity is now no longer government policy?
I think we'd be very, very cautious to say that is likely at least in the short term. I mean, the Chancellor has said that he's prepared to reset fiscal policy, but that was going to happen anyway with a weakening fiscal position actually going to increase borrowing. So if reset just means that he'll miss his fiscal target, well, with a slower economy, that was going to happen anyway. He could decide to stimulate the economy by expanding fiscal policy in the short term, so tax cuts or a boost to capital investment. But our take is it's pretty unlikely that he will tear up his plans to continue to consolidate on departmental spending and therefore continue to not cut the Scottish budget over the next few years.
Well, indeed, and that's the important thing here, isn't it? Because the Scottish budget relies on these Barnett consequentials. So if they're spending in English departments, there is extra money for Scotland. But if he doesn't change those budgets for the English departments, then potentially your worst-case scenario could come to pass.
Yes, and now obviously the next few years we know that Scotland's going to get its own tax powers, which will then start to kick in so that over time Scotland will be gradually less dependent on Barnett than it was before. But particularly in the near term, the effects of changes in Barnett will dominate the direction of the Scottish budget over the next few years, and it's highly likely that that will continue to be cut in real terms up to the end of the Parliament.
But even with those extra powers, how easy would it be for the Scottish Government, or how difficult would it be for the Scottish Government to make up that deficit that you're talking about?
Well, it's quite difficult to do that, just given the scale of the potential consolidation that's happening at the UK level. And there's also a risk that if the Scottish Government was to try and make up that deficit by increasing taxation quite significantly, then that could actually make a fragile economy even worse. And we know that the Scottish economy has been lagging behind the rest of the UK over the last year, 18 months. If you then choose to add on top of that with substantial tax rises, then there's a risk that you actually end up putting the economy even into a more precarious position.
Politicians of all hues have had something to say about your report today. Invariably, it's fair to say, blaming each other on the potential outcomes. I wonder what you make of what you've heard. Have you heard anything that gives you grounds for optimism? Well,
I mean, I think this report, obviously the immediate responsibility to react to it is with the Scottish Government. They're the ones setting out their draft budget. But we've been quite clear in this report to say it's actually a challenge to all political parties. So the Scottish Government has set out clear spending priorities for the next few years in its manifesto and in the programme for government. And they're quite big commitments in health and childcare, protecting the policing budget. Now, that has consequences. It requires cuts in other areas to pay for that. If you're then going to criticise these cuts, then you have to come forward with where you're going to make savings. Are you going to spend less on health? Are you going to spend less on the police budget? Or actually are you going to increase taxes? So you can't have it both ways. I think our report today is really a challenge to everybody to say, with a tight fiscal settlement, high demand for public services, what are you actually going to, what are your choices, what are the opportunities you've got to take different decisions if that's what you want to do?
Dr. Graham Roy, thank you for coming in to speak to us. So what have the politicians had to say about the forecast? I've been talking to the Conservative spokesperson on economy, jobs and fair work, Dean Lockhart, the Labour economy spokesperson, Jackie Baillie, and the SNP MSP, Ivan McKee, who sits on Holyrood's Finance Committee. Ivan McKee, these figures from the Fraser of Allender Institute today ultimately mean that the SNP's spending proposals have to be ripped up, don't they?
Well, I think the data we've seen today says two things. It talks about the significant cuts Scotland's faced from Westminster over the last number of years, with those set to continue into the future, a total of a 10% real terms cut over the 10-year period up to 2020. And it also talks about the significant impact that Brexit's going to have, and that's a consequence of the Tory party's internal squabble that's going to hurt Scotland very hard.
And it also talks about the fact that the Scottish Government is prioritising the police, health and childcare, and that means that there'll be even less money for other areas.
Well, the Scottish Government, the SNP government, made manifesto commitments, and that's the basis we were elected on for a third term in May this year, and that's what we'll follow through on. Now, clearly, we don't know what the full numbers are going to be because we're still waiting for Philip Hammond's autumn statement that he's had to go and have to make changes in because, as I said, of the impact of Brexit. When we see those full numbers, Derek Mackay will bring forward a budget that will meet our manifesto commitments. But as I say, the impact of Brexit, a great unknown and all a consequence of the way the Tory party has been playing games over this very important impact on the Scottish economy.
Well, Dean Lockhart addressed those issues because the Fraser of Allender Institute made it clear today that ultimately these problems that we're likely to see in the Scottish budget are a result of Brexit and are a result of the austerity that the Westminster government has been pursuing since 2010.
No, look, I would disagree with that. I think the main takeaway from this report today is a recognition that now the Scottish Government has the significant tax and spend and fiscal policies available to it to make a real difference to the Scottish economy. And that means the size, shape and the amount of Scottish budget available for public services going forward.
So how much more should they tax people then to fill that £1.6 billion if the worst case scenario happens?
Well, that's for the SNP to decide. They've been badgering for these extra powers, their hands on these levers of economic powers for a number of years. Now they have them. It's time for the SNP to tell us how they're going to manage the economy going forward. But past performance isn't a great guide for the SNP because the economy under the SNP for the past decade has underperformed the rest of the UK, and that gap between how the Scottish economy is performing and the rest of the UK is only widening. So what I would say to the SNP is you've now got the powers you're asking for, step up to the plate and do something with those powers. It's time that you did something for the Scottish economy.
Jackie Baillie, the best that your party has offered is this 1p increase in income tax at the last election. But it's quite clear from these figures that if the worst case scenario comes to pass, that won't be nearly enough.
Well, we actually had a number of different proposals, but what we're seeing is very slow economic growth in Scotland, slower than the rest of the UK. So we're not going to be able to grow ourselves out of these problems anytime soon.
So you have to tax
more. We are also seeing a 3 to 6% worst case scenario cut. And of course, the Scottish Government, having made certain commitments, these cuts will fall on unprotected areas like local government, with an estimate of something like £1 billion to be slashed out of local government budgets. Now, that means, money taken away from schools and education, money taken away from social care for some of the most vulnerable people.
But
we had very clear proposals.
Well, indeed, and your proposal would only raise £500 million from that 1p in income tax. So it still doesn't go anywhere near to even filling the gap from the best case scenario.
We had a number of clear proposals. The 1p was just one of them. In addition, we said we would have a 50p top rate of income tax so that those who earn the most could contribute a little bit more, and we would have put that into closing the education attainment gap. But, in addition to that, we were very clear that this Scottish Government has choices. It has a choice to be anti-austerity. That's what they said. The SNP said they wanted to do. They wanted to be anti-austerity. Yet at each occasion when they're challenged about this, they simply pass on Westminster cuts. Frankly, that's not good enough.
Is it time, Ivan McKee, to consider raising taxes?
Well, we've made manifesto commitments on taxes,
but the
which are very clear.
circumstances have changed.
Well, as I said, we've made manifesto commitments on tax that are very clear not to increase the basic rate, and we have made changes. We've already committed to make changes to the allowances for higher rate taxpayers, which will raise additional money for the Scottish economy.
But nowhere near the £1.6 billion if this worst case scenario comes to pass.
Well, as I said, that's a consequence of the Brexit situation. And Derek Mackay, as I said, will bring forward a budget in a few weeks' time, which will lay our spending plans for the coming year and our tax plans. But as I said, we've made manifesto commitments, so we'll stick to, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the significant cuts because of UK government austerity are what's driving this, and it's going to get worse because of the Brexit situation and the great uncertainty that's caused. Now, what
there are new powers coming to the Scottish Parliament. It is about time the SNP exercise those powers. So far as I can see, they're proposing to cut air passenger duty at a time where the overall budget is being constrained in this way, that cuts are being visited on public services across Scotland. They
Well,
want
Jackie
to give a
Baillie
tax
well knows,
cut for cheaper airline fares. It's just the wrong priority.
If Jackie Baillie should understand, if she knew the way these things work, that will drive growth in the economy, because what you're doing is increasing business links and making it easier for business to do business internationally, and you're improving tourism. So that's exactly the reason for that.
Let me bring in Dean Lockhart
APD
at this
will
point.
improve the public services finances in Scotland.
Let me bring in Dean Lockhart at this point. The Chancellor has said that he needs to reset the economy. Would you welcome a move away from austerity?
Well, I think the autumn statement is going to take place at the end of November. So obviously we need to wait to see what the Chancellor comes up with. But what I would say...
you could lobby for more money for Scotland, for instance.
Well, I think what's really relevant here are the GERS numbers that came out last week that showed that public spending in Scotland is £15 billion more than the tax revenue taken in Scotland. So we're already seeing a union dividend. In other words, Scotland benefiting from being part of the United Kingdom to the tune of £1,600 per person in Scotland.
And how much of a consolation will that be if the Fraser F. Allender Institute is right and £1 billion is taken out of council budgets?
Well, that's for the SNP to decide. You know, it's the SNP now have their hands on the levers of the economy, and they have said all along that they have said...
The problem is caused by the UK government's austerity policy.
Ivan, I'm sorry. You have said all along that once you get your hands on the levers of economic power, you will be able to grow the Scottish economy faster than the rest of the UK. So the proof will be in the pudding. We haven't. You've had these powers for a number of months now, but there has been absolute silence as to how you're going to use them. So it's time for you to step up. And it's time for the SNP to step up and tell the Scottish people how you're going to use these powers.
Well, I think you've already seen we invested an extra 100 million in capital investment.
That's old money.
To move the Scottish budget, to move the Scottish economy forward. And we've allocated another £500 million through the Scottish Growth Fund to invest in helping business innovate and export. And that's the kind of things we need to do to get the growth rates up to where they should be.
Sorry.
Well, let me ask Jackie Baillie a question here. Is it unfortunate that in this argument over austerity and the resetting of the UK economy that Jeremy Corbyn and his front bench team seem to be fairly ineffective?
No, I think this is about what we do in Scotland. There are new powers...
The money comes from Westminster.
Yeah, but there are new powers being transferred to Scotland. And I well remember, as you do, Nicola Sturgeon going down to lecture people prior to the UK general election about how to do anti-austerity. It's just a shame she doesn't do it herself. And what we've witnessed tonight is the SNP arguing with the Tories, blaming each other, and actually the people of Scotland deserve so much more than this. There are £1 billion of cuts under the worst-case scenario coming to local government. That's schools, that's social care for some of our most vulnerable. And frankly, you know, to have these two argue with each other simply isn't good enough.
Well, I think, Jackie, you'll remember that Labour actually caused the financial crisis in the first place. And it was the Conservative Party. It was the Conservative Party that had to clean up the mess made by the Labour Party.
Over that one for a very long time. So let me thank all three of you for joining us this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, tonight on the election trail in the United States, Republican Donald Trump is rolling out proposals which he says will make childcare more affordable. Meanwhile, his Democratic rival Hillary Clinton is still out of the picture as she recovers from pneumonia. So has the last few days been a turning point in this campaign? Professor Chris Carman from Glasgow University has been watching events closely and has been giving me his view.
We've seen an important point. I'm not sure. We'll know whether it's a turning point when we get the polling data. Right now, it's too early to know. So we're speculating about what public opinion is going to do and how it's going to react to the events with Hillary Clinton and the health issues, and then Donald Trump and his policy launches and all of that. So it's an important point, and because it plays into the important narratives that have been coming out and have been raised previously around the health issues and around believability, honesty, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, Donald Trump's making an announcement tonight about childcare. It seems that he is trying to focus on policy in the absence of Hillary Clinton rather than just hammering home this message about her ill health.
Yeah, somewhat remarkably, he's been kind of quiet about the health issue. He wished her well, said he hopes she recovers soon, and then he quickly pivoted to talking about himself and about how he's going to release his health records, I guess, later this week, he says. So we'll see what happens with that. But then they're also using this time. They wouldn't have rushed anything out. They would have already had this planned, but they can get more media attention, particularly because there's quite a few things that Donald Trump did over the past weekend that they want to sort of quickly hide under the rug. There were issues around the Trump Foundation that came out, and he made a few comments that they probably would rather not get too much attention.
You mentioned there this issue of him having to disclose his health records. It's an interesting phenomenon in the United States, this whole thing about disclosure. Hillary Clinton trying, she says, to remain a private person, but people maybe believing that she's got something to hide.
Yeah, Americans demand a very high level of information about their candidates. Something like 86%, according to a relatively recent poll, of people say that the health of the candidates is important to them and is a factor in thinking about their vote. So Americans demand and have demanded for quite some time a lot of information about health, also about tax records, about income, and these sorts of things. So
and these are difficult areas for both of these candidates.
They are, particularly when you want to talk about scrutiny and these sorts of things. Now, the Clintons arguably have had to reveal an awful lot over a long period of time since Bill Clinton was president. And Hillary Clinton, because she was Secretary of State and because she was a senator, she has had to have these records released publicly for a long period of time. Donald Trump has not. Donald Trump has, because he was private companies, he's managed to keep all of his records relatively close and personal.
And we've seen replacing Hillary Clinton on the stump, her daughter Chelsea. That's not something you would see in this country again. I mean, she's not running for office, although Barack Obama's also been out campaigning for her too. Barack
Obama, Bill Clinton, and Chelsea have all been out, yes, exactly. It's much more of a family affair. You get the first family in the United States. And, this goes back, if we think to JFK. We had the Camelot and the family, and we see the families being raised. And of course, because Chelsea Clinton was raised in the White House, partially, we have this idea that she's a public citizen in that regard as well.
So we've still got several more weeks to go in this campaign. We've got debates, TV debates to come. They will be, I'd imagine, fascinating, but also potentially crucial in people making their minds up.
It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the debates. I think there's a distinct possibility that they could end up being quite nasty, probably maybe some of the nastiest debates that we've seen in presidential debate history. We can expect Donald Trump is probably going to come out fairly hard. On the other hand, his campaign manager now, Kellyanne Conway, she is going to probably try to get him to rein it in. So a lot of the more reserved Trump that we've seen over the past week or two, many people think that's been her influence, trying to get him to stay on message a bit more, trying to get him to appear presidential. If he starts attacking Hillary Clinton, he starts not looking presidential, so that gets to be a problem. For Hillary Clinton, she has to, again, appear to be presidential. She has to be authoritative. She doesn't have so much of a problem being authoritative. She has a problem being likable. And, of course, she's going to get hit on the issues that you already raised earlier about being believable and being trustworthy, which are seen as being the big negatives for her.
Well, it'll be fascinating.
That it will.
Chris Carman, thank you for coming in to talk to us.
Thank you.
Well, to discuss today's stories, I'm joined by the Press Association's Lindsay Bewes and by the Daily Record's political editor, David Clegg. Good evening to you both. Let's start with these figures from the Fraser of Allender Institute. Really big numbers, Lindsay Bewes. Really quite worrying, I'd imagine, for the Scottish Government as Derek Mackay looks to his budget in a couple of months' time.
Yes, some really tough decisions for Derek Mackay to take in his first budget. I mean, I suppose they would want to highlight the figure that's been widely sort of headlined today is the worst case scenario figure for the next 4 years, but nonetheless there's going to be some very tough decisions for Derek Mackay to take, and given that he has already, the SNP government has already pledged that they're going to protect certain areas of spending, it does mean that people are looking at where the axe is going to fall and local government is looking vulnerable again.
Yeah, all the politicians blaming each other today. I mean, there's nothing new in that, David Clegg, but we didn't really get many concrete answers as to how they might deal with this.
No, we didn't. I think the report actually is a very useful tool for the budget process coming up because it is very clear, does set out the challenges and also offers some solutions. One thing that it said, which I think would be excellent actually, is that we need some kind of framework for what we want from the money that we have, how we want to spend it and what outcomes we want, because we didn't really get much of that in the election campaign, the Holyrood election campaign this year. We got a particular SNP campaign poster which said, you know, we all benefit from our policies. Well, actually, that's not possible in these circumstances. So who do you want to benefit and how do you want to make them benefit is something which I think would be very useful. I think that the UK government, with the Brexit scenario, clearly there was going to be cuts to the Scottish budget, whatever happened. But Brexit has made it worse. Brexit has made it tougher, and it's also fogged the climate. So it's going to be, with the new income tax powers coming in, there could have been a suggestion that the Scottish government was going to be more on the spot for the decisions they made. But I think Brexit's muddied the water there.
Yeah, indeed, and we need to wait, I guess, to see what Philip Hammond comes up with in his budget, because that will have a knock-on effect as to how much money the Scottish Government gets.
Sure. And Derek Mackay is going to be looking very closely at the decisions that Philip Hammond takes and what he's got to say in the autumn statement. And of course, he'll be bringing his budget forward pretty quickly, actually, after Philip Hammond lets us know what his plans are. He's been talking already about a kind of Brexit-proofing budget, kind of looking ahead to kind of cushioning the economy when we do go into Brexit. And he's actually been kind of pulling back a little bit from the austerity that we heard from George Osborne as well. So it's going to be interesting to see what he's got to say about borrowing, investing, infrastructure. And those are all things actually John Swinney wanted to see in the last couple of years. So it's going to be interesting to see how Derek Mackay reacts to that.
Well, indeed, and of course, Derek Mackay has to get this budget through Parliament, with the SNP having lost their majority at the last election. So a lot of horse trading to come.
A lot of horse trading. They are quite close to a majority, so I wonder if they'll have that much trouble. They just need 3 or 4 people to come on side and they'll be there. I think the main concern for Derek Mackay is going to be, how does he keep all his manifesto commitments? How does he continue to say that all the problems are caused by the UK government without really taking any responsibility, but also take the credit for the policies that are popular, such as the protection of the NHS and stuff like that.
Well, let's talk about something else that happened today. John Swinney making the statement to Parliament. He's been talking about empowering teachers for some time since he took over as Education Secretary. He says teachers will be empowered to take the best decisions for their pupils. This is a major review. What we didn't really get was much detail, because he's now going to consult to come up with the best way for doing this. Lindsay.
Yeah, that's right. He's talking about this consultation period. And it really kind of leaves you asking a question about where councils are going to stand in all of this, because he's saying that, we'll be starting with the schools, and we'll be talking about, the power being with the schools, and then talking about reserving power up to local authorities, or, centralising power as is needed. But it's not really clear what role councillors are going to play. He said it's not going to be academies, it's not going to be the way that the English schools have gone. But at the same time, councils will be wondering, well, where are we left in terms of accountability, in terms of, providing for that sort of inclusive ethos that they have done so far in the Scottish education system?
Yeah, do we have to accept that this is a national service, as it were, that councils have a bit of a role in, but actually all the decisions come from central government now?
Well, they're saying that they're going to devolve power down further, straight to head teachers or to schools, so I'm not sure that quite works. I think there'll be some very sore councillors today. Not only are they looking like £1 billion coming off their budget, but they've also effectively had education taken out of their remit. So what it will be, the devil will of course be in the detail, but I think the interesting thing will be is, how are these regional boards going to work? Will councillors have input in them, or will they be taken out of that process? And in the end, who's going to have oversight of? You can say as much power as possible, but at the end of the day, you've got to make sure that the power is being used properly. Who's going to do that?
Yeah, and this, I suppose, all of this, the potential cut to the council budgets and education, giving us some of the framework for the council elections next year.
Yes, absolutely. These are going to be defining issues in those elections. And actually, you could say councils are going to be sitting thinking today, well, we had this Fraser-Allender report suggesting that our budgets are going to be cut again. We have this threat to the sort of the education services. Some of them will see it. And it's really kind of setting up this kind of war between the Scottish Government and councils, which we saw last year with all the kind of arguments there were over the funding cut and resistance there. So I think we're going to see more of that play out going into these elections.
The politics of that are quite interesting, because we'll be 5 years on from the last local government election. The popularity of the SNP in that period has increased quite dramatically after the independence referendum, so you would be expecting them to pick up more councils, yet you have an SNP government that appears to be about to start a fight with them.
Well, just in the last minute or so of the programme, should we talk about soggy bottoms? Should we talk about the Great British Bake Off? It seems to be the story that's dominating everybody's thinking. The fact the BBC is losing it. It's going to Channel 4 tonight. We hear that Mel and Sue are no longer going to be part of the show. Is this going to leave a big gap in your life, Lindsay?
I don't know. I'm a fan. I'm not a super fan, but I have to say I've seen quite a lot of people saying today that, you know, if Mel and Sue go and if Paul and Mary go, then actually all Channel 4 has bought is just a few pots and pans and a tent. So what's going to happen to Bake Off if it doesn't have Mel and Sue and if it doesn't have Paul and Mary? I don't know.
I would just like to say to Channel 4 that me and Lindsay are available for half Mel and
Yeah.
Sue's price.
Really?
If they're looking new presenters.
I don't know if this works out as an audition or not. But I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? This is a show that was just about baking and we end up, you know, with a £25 million price tag for it.
I'm not somebody who watches it very often, but it has been incredibly popular. The success and the talk about it has been quite dramatic, and the fact that it's generating such news just by moving channels, I think says something about how it's captured the cultural zeitgeist. Whether Channel 4 come to regret the money they're sinking into it because they've lost their presenters, I suspect they're going to lose some viewers because it does seem to have annoyed some people that it's moving.
Well, at this rate, you might end up in the role occupied by Mary Berry and Paul Hollywood. Never mind Mel and Sue. You can only dream, exactly. Thank you both very much indeed. That is it for tonight. We're back tomorrow night at the same time. Until then, bye-bye.